Welcome to today's session on VMware vCloud Air. My name is Travis Lawrence. I am a systems engineer with Arrow ECS. vCloud Air is VMware's public cloud offering, meaning a publicly available infrastructure that runs vSphere that can easily integrate with our on-premise infrastructure. So if you have customers that leverage vSphere on-premise today, we can really gain that benefit of having VM and application portability between that on-premise data center and VMware's public cloud offering, which they manage. Think of it really as a data center for rent. So we have integrated on-premise and cloud infrastructure, allowing us to make that decision based on ROI or application availability, whether we want those customers to manage their infrastructure on-premise or whether it makes more sense in VMware's cloud environment. Today's session, we'll talk about a few things. One being legacy applications. How do we migrate a legacy application into vCloud Air? What are the ramifications around that? Another one is DR scenarios for vCloud Air specifically, or VMware's DR as a service offering. Also talking about application and licensing portability. We see a lot of questions around that topic when we're going to migrate an application to the cloud. What does that mean for licensing? And then finally, to cover vRealize automation and how that integrates with the vCloud Air, what it looks like to create a VM from a self-service portal in vRealize automation. Joining us today will be Kevin Grote, our VMware Technical Partner Manager. He's got some really great sessions here presenting with a whiteboard and I think the value in this is he'll go over the vCloud Air offering, but at a level that both technical and sales teams could leverage this in customer environments. So please feel free to review this video, really take in the whiteboard piece of that. I think it's really valuable for the sales and technical parts of our business. And really finally, from an Arrow perspective, we're really seeing traction around vCloud Air for backup and disaster recovery scenarios to start off with. So we get many customers or many resellers have success in those scenarios where a customer is small enough that they need an off-premise infrastructure to run disaster recovery or to push backups to. And then from there, we really see that initial win accelerate in other deployments for Tier 2 and Tier 3 applications. And then finally, I think we also see on-demand with the new announcement of VMware's on-demand release of vCloud Air as a way for you as resellers to have customers test out this offering in a pay-as-you-go kind of scenario. If you have other questions about today's sessions, please feel free to reach out to me, tlawrence@arrow.com. I will also be available at the end of the session to kind of wrap things up with some other contact information. But for now, we'll pass this off to Kevin Grote for the beginning of the session.
Hello, and welcome to today's session on vCloud Air. My name is Kevin Grote, Senior Engineer and Technical Partner Manager here at VMware, and today we're going to be taking a look at several different use case scenarios for vCloud Air, including legacy applications, disaster recovery, including active-active and active-passive sites, and we'll also be looking at application portability, then having some discussion around license portability as it relates to vCloud Air. Thanks for taking the time to join today. Let's get started. So let's take a look at legacy application utilization. So for most of our customers, legacy applications are de rigueur. It's what they deal with day in, day out. And in fact, they've got so much wrapped up inside these legacy applications that more often than not, they are in no position to make changes to them. Now, this poses a very interesting conundrum when we talk about preparing for cloud. You see, most customers, they're going to have legacy applications set in stone inside of their existing data center. And then they're going to have all of their new applications being built out inside with their cloud provider. For most of them, they're fine with where they are with the new applications. After all, those applications have been built for cloud, on cloud platforms, and they really don't maybe see a need to change. Additionally, when it comes to their legacy applications, they're probably feeling the same way. However, there's some stopping points, some potential points of block or fail when we look at legacy application integration as customers progress through their journey into cloud, or specifically into hybrid. One that is all too common is administration. Let's say that we've got Bob the admin over here. Bob wrote a legacy application some years back, but Bob, he no longer works here. And so nobody knows how this application works anymore. But the problem gets thicker. This legacy application now needs to scale. Turns out Bob was a genius. And Bob developed an application that's going to drive this corporation to all new heights, but he was just ahead of his time. And so now we have to figure out a way to take this application and port it out into the cloud so we can create greater scale, greater geographic efficiencies, and have it be more consumable by more people. There's a problem. For most cloud providers, they can't deal with a legacy application. Again, because everything they've built is based upon cloud readiness and cloud readiness only. So there's a difference between being cloud ready and being cloud only. It's a very, very big distinction here. Now, let's say that we have an issue that goes the opposite direction. We've got an application that we thought was going to just change the world in cloud, but turns out it's not. The application actually needs to be ported back into an on-premise solution. Maybe for geography, maybe for resource contention, maybe it just wasn't successful enough in the cloud. It could be a number of things. Or maybe it was successful and they're wanting to move an application or a workload back down into their on-prem data center because now it's ready for production. Could be a number of different things that are making this happen. This too can be an issue. Why? Because a lot of cloud platforms and on-premise platforms don't play well together. Now, this isn't to say that you can't port workloads from one place to the next, but unless you have a common infrastructure beneath them, you're going to have all sorts of changes and specifics that need to be addressed, things like file names and extensions and formats, etc. And these things can become very problematic when you talk about doing them in scale. But when we look at vCloud Air and vSphere are all based upon vSphere as an infrastructure. So whatever they have on-premise, they're also going to have off-premise and have the ability to have those workloads function equally in both formats. Because inside of vCloud Air, you're getting a vSphere data center for rent. That means all of the functionality that you would normally have, high availability, fault tolerance, this is all built in and it doesn't cost extra. But it also means something very important when we look at the little conundrums that we proposed. Let's look back at that legacy application that needed to move out in the cloud, but it couldn't. Maybe it was built on DOS. Maybe it was built on Windows 98, who knows? Because in vCloud Air, we have a vSphere data center for rent, that workload is going to become welcome out in the cloud. Additionally, because we're using vSphere in vCloud Air and on-premise, those workloads that might have to move from the cloud back are also going to be welcome. This means now that when we're looking at the way we're serving users, and users are consuming not just legacy and not just new applications, but both, and in different varying qualities and quantities and varieties, and they're mixing it up, we need to be able to scale along with them. vCloud Air really gives our customers and you the ability to create these sorts of functional paradigm shifts, where we're no longer looking at just what exists inside the data center and then what is somewhere else, but to truly have an integrated approach to on-prem and off-prem solutions. So I want to talk about different ideas around disaster recovery. A lot of times we get questions about how best to address disaster recovery. Now, inside vCloud Air, we have vCloud Air Disaster Recovery as a Service. Disaster Recovery as a Service has a very distinct place inside of the ecosystem. For example, if we start over here on this side, we've got a solution where the customer has a primary data center, and maybe they even have a secondary data center. Maybe they're even using replication between these 2 points to make sure that data is in sync, either asynchronously or synchronously. And perhaps they're using an existing VMware solution like Site Recovery Manager to ensure that they have the ability to fail over from one site to the next. But let's say the customer doesn't have that secondary site, or maybe they're just looking for a tertiary site in order to create that trinity of recovery. This is when we can talk about the inclusion of disaster recovery as a service. Like I said, perhaps they don't have a secondary site and they're wanting to take the workloads from their primary site and move them out to the cloud. That's definitely going to be DR as a service. Maybe they're taking their fundamental workloads and they're pushing those to the second site using Site Recovery Manager. But they're looking to take some additional workloads and push them out into the cloud. Maybe their highest tier workloads. They'd be able to move those out into the cloud. So, for an example, you may have tier 1 workloads out here, maybe even tier 2. You may keep tier 3 down inside of the second site, depending upon proximity or the advantage that it's going to give to that specific customer. So, on top of all of this, having the ability to do this and be able to do it regardless of the operating system, because again, disaster recovery as a service is still running on top of a vSphere environment. So we have flexibility and the capability to do more with disaster recovery than the customer would normally be doing. And for those customers who don't have an existing disaster recovery as a solution, DR as a service is an absolute conversation to have. The simple way to clue into that conversation is simply to ask them what their RPO and RTO are. RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective, the point in time at which data needs to be restored in order to meet a service level agreement. RTO is your Recovery Time Objective. How long before these resources can be back online? When do they have to be back online in order to meet that service level agreement? With disaster recovery as a service, we have SLAs built into our RTO and RPO. You have a 4-hour RTO and you have a 15-minute to 24-hour recovery point objective. And people will ask, well, Kevin, why is it 15 minutes to 24 hours? Seems like a pretty big disparity. Well, the difference is we have no idea the size of the deltas between those files, between what's coming from the primary site out into the cloud. We don't know whether we're moving something the size of a golf ball or something the size of a glacier. So it's going to depend based upon that traffic, based upon how often it's being replicated, as to how long that recovery point objective is actually going to be. But these are good points to remember when you're talking to your customers. Let's take a look over on this other side. It's a little different set of ideas. Sometimes customers aren't great enough with just doing what we consider a warm standby, which is what they're getting with disaster recovery as a service. They're not fine with just having the workload there when they need it. Maybe they want it to be an instant on type of solution where they're looking at active recovery. Or more to the point, maybe they're wanting to tier out that solution. So let's take a look at a way you could use disaster recovery in conjunction with vCloud Air to create a tiered disaster recovery solution. Let's say that out here we have Tier 1. And Tier 1 applications, those are comprised of databases, communications, everything that the business needs to get back up and running because it can't stay down for too long. What they could do is they could use their primary data center, and then they could use a dedicated cloud instance with vCloud Air, and then replicate the storage between point A and point B. Now, vSphere replication probably isn't going to be fast enough for doing something like an active site-to-site, but they can use products like DoubleTake, for example, to be able to create that replication. Now they're going to have virtual machines that live over here and are being actively replicated onto the other site, and perhaps they're even running as needed, so they can have active site recovery. But they might not want to do that for every single workload that they have. In fact, a lot of workloads that would become very cost prohibitive. So they can take their other tiers, maybe Tier 2, Tier 3. What would be in Tier 2 or 3? Well, maybe development, testing, could be accounting, could be marketing. Lots of things would go into Tier 2, Tier 3, things that are important to the business, but they're not critical to the business as we start diving into hour by hour. And so in that situation, they could use a disaster recovery instance with vCloud Air. And then they're using vSphere replication to move from point A to point B. And then for the rest of those workloads, they have their 4-hour RTO and their 15-minute to 24-hour recovery point objective. So when you're talking to your customers about vCloud Air, it doesn't just have to be for workloads. Additionally, when you're talking to your customers about vCloud Air disaster recovery as a service, it doesn't have to stop there. You can combine the architectures. You can do something different. You've probably heard me say before, I think that the best thing that we can do for our customers when we're talking, as trusted advisors and architects of solutions is to utilize as many of the colors in the box of crayons as we're given, and to be able to use the ones that are reflective of the customer's need. If we look at these solutions and look at what we're capable of doing with vCloud Air and vCloud Air Disaster Recovery as a Service, using ideas like this allow us a little more extensibility and a little more expanse when we're talking about the colors that we do use to solve that customer solution. So if we want to look at license portability, a lot of people get very, very confused about this. So hopefully this whiteboard will help clear that up. So let's assume that we have our primary data center over on the far left. Now, the two diagrams that I have to the right show a virtual private cloud instance of vCloud Air, and the bottom shows a dedicated cloud instance. If you're not familiar with those two differences, the distinction is very clear. A virtual private cloud instance is shared resources. It's logical isolation in the cloud. Dedicated cloud is actual physical isolation of resources. So you're not sharing any physical resource with anyone else and any other neighbor. So with that understood, let's take a look at how the decision whether to go virtual private cloud or dedicated cloud impacts licensure when we're looking at something like Windows. Out here inside the data center, we've got a Windows virtual machine. We decide that we want to port that machine out into our virtual private cloud instance. We need to understand that when that happens, there is going to be a cost incurred, because what's happening is we're now going to have to use a Windows operating system license in order to maintain adherence with Microsoft licensing agreements. So that virtual machine that gets moved out is going to incur an operating system license. Just the same as if you had gone out there and done a net new build of that Windows virtual machine. That too would incur a license cost. Now, what we should remember is that Windows virtual machine that's sitting over there in the data center, once that machine is brought over into the cloud, you can take that old system and remove it from inventory, power it off, delete it, trash it, whatever you need to do. At that point then, a customer can reuse that license and they can bring that down into another workload inside of the data center and still be in compliance with their licensing. Additionally, if a customer wants to look down road, they can also modify their licensing so that they're maybe not getting as much next time, because they know they're going to have some workloads that are being moved over into the cloud. Now, this is also very different when we talk about a dedicated cloud. There's a distinction here that occurs, and the distinction is shared resources. And that's really the trigger when it comes to the operating systems like Windows. Now, this doesn't impact open source operating systems, Linux, CentOS, Ubuntu, etc. Those you can build with impunity out into the cloud. There's not a licensing cost for those. But when we're talking about Windows, we have to be a little more cognizant of what's going on. But if we're using a dedicated cloud and we want to move that workload out, that same Windows virtual machine, we are not going to incur a licensing cost because we're allowed to move onto another non-shared set of resources. Now, you're not going to free up that license back on the other side, but you're not going to incur a new cost. It's also important to understand that operating systems are different than applications. In fact, if you look at the licensing requirements when it comes to applications, you'll see that for many, things like SharePoint, etc., those are going to be just fine to move into either instance, and you will retain some license portability. But again, to underline, when you're looking at moving virtual machines, Windows virtual machines, from a data center out into a virtual private cloud where you have logical isolation, you are going to incur licensing costs. This is not true for dedicated cloud. But if you do incur that cost, you're able to recapture the machine, recapture the license, and then use it elsewhere.
To add a little bit of clarity into this whole idea of a virtual private cloud versus physical cloud, we can see that inside of this user interface, we have virtual data centers, and these virtual data centers are virtual private clouds. You can see here that as I hover over this particular one, it becomes clickable so that I can get into actually what resources have been occupied inside of this virtual private cloud. Now, going back to the discussion about license portability and accessibility and building machines and moving machines in and out of the cloud. It's kind of why I wanted to bring you here today. If we were to create machines or have something like, say, vRealize automation, which I'll show you in a moment, create a machine on our behalf, then those machines would appear here. But additionally, if we wanted to build our own virtual machine, we could build it here or build it using an automation engine. This speaks directly to the conversation about license portability. And this, because it is a virtual private cloud, is why you're seeing a cost being associated with those Windows operating systems. You see, though, that there is no cost associated with the open source operating systems. And again, to wrap up, if you're using a virtual private cloud, there will be a cost incurred for the OS. If you're using a dedicated cloud, you will be able to port those licenses over. From here, you go through, create the machine, costs are incurred as needed, and then the machine becomes available to you.
So there's always a lot of talk around machine portability. In fact, if you had looked at the conversation that we had about the legacy applications, we were talking about the ability to move workloads back and forth inside of vCloud Air. And again, as we mentioned, vCloud Air uses vSphere as its foundation. So when you're getting vCloud Air, you're getting a vSphere data center for rent, so it's capable of handling all of those operating systems. If we want to look very quickly at the fundamentals of machine portability, let's give kind of a 101 into that. So we see here we've got a data center and we've got what could be a virtual private cloud or a dedicated cloud. It really wouldn't matter for this conversation. We know that both of them are running vSphere. And we know that we have a workload that we want to move from point A to point B. So we've got different means by which we can utilize this sort of machine portability. The simplest is utilizing vCloud Connector. vCloud Connector gives us the capacity to move a workload from point A to point B. So we could call that a migrate. We're able to migrate that workload out. And again, if we looked at the licensing conversation, we also have to be cognizant of the type of workload and the type of destination that we're using. But for now, let's just assume that we're moving the workload from point A to point B. This also means that we could move that workload not only into vCloud Air, but using vCloud Connector could move that workload into other clouds as well. So now that workload is becoming significantly more portable. And once it's out in the cloud, doesn't mean that that's where it has to stay. It also has the ability to move back. Again, going to our conversation about legacy applications where we said sometimes a workload born in the cloud or arrives in the cloud doesn't necessarily stay in the cloud. This is where we need to have solutions wrapped around the ideas of true machine portability. There are lots of different options for what can happen with those machines once they're out there. And when the machine's out, we can ensure that it will be secured and that we're able to allow customers to bring their own security model or adopt our own, including features inside of the Edge Gateway, firewall, DHCP, NAT translation, load balancing, and the rest. But if they want to integrate with their own security system or their own load balancing system, they can do that too. Machine portability carries further when we look at the idea of vCloud Air as an endpoint. vCloud Air has the ability to serve as an endpoint for things like vRealize automation. Meaning that customers And by customers, could be users, could be people in other departments, anyone that's accessing your resources. They can request resources and then have those resources provided to them based upon policy in either the physical data center or the cloud. All based upon what's going to be most cost efficient, what's most performant inside of that solution. Once those workloads are created, again, they can be secured, applied with their own security or ours, and those workloads can retain their portability moving back into the primary data center or moving into other clouds. The ideas of machine portability are foundational to understanding vCloud Air and to looking at it not just as another cloud resource, but as a fluid, flexible pool of resources that can be utilized in collaboration with the existing investments customers have already made inside of their infrastructure.
So to further illustrate the point we were talking about with machine portability inside of vCloud Air and the functionality that's gained by utilizing a platform like this, I've got a demonstration here, and inside of this environment we have vRealize automation. This is version 6.2, and inside of vRealize automation we're allowed to target endpoints. Now, endpoint is basically just a pool of resources that we're going to use for automation in order to provision resources. You can see that I've got vCloud Air already set up. So let's take a look at just how vCloud Air impacts the idea of machine portability. vCloud Air becomes part of an automation endpoint simply by using its API and its organizational identifiers. Once it's in place, we're able to access all of the compute resources that are available to us inside of vCloud Air. So all of the compute, storage, networking resources are all going to be accounted for here. But what does this mean when we talk about workload portability and being able to provide greater access using things like vCloud Air to our customers? This means that these resources can help us provision machinery. Specifically, if a user comes in and requests resources inside of an automation platform like this, they're going to be able to take those resources. The automation engine will then provision those resources as needed, as we see here in this request. It will provision the resources based upon policy, and then it will align those resources with the proper endpoint. So to bring vCloud Air back into the mix, we have the capacity to utilize this amazing platform as one more resource that we can provision against when we're talking about leveraging things like cloud automation. So in this instance, if I were to request this, I'd see it pop up here in my list of requests, and then I would be able to see that those servers were created successfully. I would also be able to access those systems as needed. All of this because we're integrating vCloud Air not just as a standalone quote-unquote cloud, but as an integrated, interoperable pool of resources that we can fold into the greater ecosystem of the customer's data center.
Thanks again, as always, for taking the time to join me today. Hope you found value in these sessions, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and to connect with your VMware blogs, your local account representatives and engineers, so they can tell you more about these fantastic products.
Thank you, Kevin, for that session. That was very informative. I think we've seen with vCloud Air that it's a simple way to extend on-premise infrastructure. So for situations where IT admins, they don't have to manage and maintain off-site infrastructure for DR scenarios, or if you want to be able to easily expand that infrastructure for test and dev environments, again, that underlying infrastructure is managed by VMware, and we can easily port applications in and out of our on-premise cloud or into vCloud Air. And I think that application portability is a key component of this as well, as we saw today. So being able to easily port applications either using vCloud Connector into that vCloud Air instance, or being able to easily migrate those back. And then it becomes even more valuable when we use a cloud management platform like vRealize Automation to automatically or seamlessly provision a virtual workload on-premise, or extending that to vCloud Air and doing that off-premise as well. I hope the whiteboard sessions were valuable today, and those are things that you can share with your customers, that they were useful. If you have further questions around vCloud Air or around any of the other VMware products, please reach out to your inside sales team member or to myself. You may contact me at tlawrence@arrow.com or on Twitter at @tlawrence. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks again to Kevin. We will see you for the next session.